So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you today, the Guringai people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Kelly Mitchell, for those of you who haven't met me before, from the Historical Services team at Sandstone Library. And today I have the pleasure of introducing North Sydney Council's historian, Dr Ian Hoskins, for the third in our online history talk series, Bedrock, the significance of sandstone in North Sydney. We hope to continue this series, so please keep an eye on our website for further details. And if you've missed either of the previous talks, recordings are available to watch online. You can just search the website for history talks to find the relevant links. If you have any questions during the talk, then feel free to write them into the chat box, and I'll put them to Ian for a short Q&A session at the end of his presentation. But for any other general inquiries, such as requests for digital images, then please email localhistory@northsydney.nsw.gov.au, and we will do our best to assist. And so now I will hand over to Ian. Sorry, Ian, I'm clicking ask to unmute. There we go.
All right, yeah, so I think I was just muted. So thanks for everyone for logging on. And thank you, Kelly, for the introduction. And this is number 3, as Kelly said, in our history talk series, Bedrock. I've got the title slightly wrong there, Sandstone and the History of North Sydney. The significance of sandstone in North Sydney, I think, is what was on another page. I'm trying to move forward here. Why is that not working? There we go. Bit of a delay. Okay. Sydney and North Sydney are sandstone towns or cities and suburbs, in the way that London is a limestone city, Bath is made of Bath stone, and marble is most associated with Rome. Sandstone is the stone that it gives Sydney its distinctive character, and North Sydney no less than the city on the south side. And I'm going to be showing you about 40 or 50 pictures today, taken in my wanderings around North Sydney, and also drawn from the collection here. And this is one of my favourites, which is in Winter Avenue, not far from the library, but just over on the border of Neutral Bay there, which really does illustrate the point that North Sydney is built on sandstone, because you've got a sandstone bedrock there, and you've got the sandstone ashlar blocks built on the bedrock, and then you've got a huge outcrop of natural rock again, which presumably pre-existed everyone, and then you've got the house built on top of that. So it's Winter Avenue is one of my favourite little streets because of the extraordinary escarpment on one side of it. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I love the way that these tree ferns are popping up there as well. Okay, so just to get our geology right, this is a cross section, and here's Sydney, and you can take that to be North Sydney as well. And the dotted strata there is the Hawkesbury sandstone, RH. And that thin layer there, which really is extending sort of west of Ryde, to give you some orientation, is what's called Wienermatter shale or clay. And that's important because the soil around Sydney is really very sandy, and North Sydney as well. It gets a little bit more fertile out west. When Philip rolled up, he decided to pitch tents and slowly build the town at the tank stream in Sydney Cove. He did so because of the fresh water, but then he regretted the fact that the soil there was so poor. And when he established the second major settlement at Parramatta, he wondered whether in fact that should have been his first port of call, because it could actually grow things there. The first 5 years of settlement in Sydney were called the hungry years, because they really had difficulty providing for themselves and were surviving off dried rations and what fish they could catch, and it was all pretty difficult. But the sandstone still extends, despite the layer of shale and clay, all the way up to the Blue Mountains, and you can see the uplift there. There's the Gross River and Lithgow. So a lot of what you see up in the Blue Mountains is sandstone, but some of it's a mix of other clays and shale. That third group there is called the Narrabeen group, which is a mix of different types of stone. And the black seams here are coal underneath there. And this is an overall view. Let's look at this one first. You can see the dots here are the Hawkesbury sandstone, and all over North Sydney then, and up the Central Coast is sandstone going all around there and up on the south side too. And then there's this huge area here of the shale and clay, which is as close into the west as Ashfield actually. And it's that clay, well, actually even closer than that, because the Brickfield Hill, which is pretty well part of the CBD today, is just north of Central Station. That's where they made the first bricks in 1789 or 1790. So there's clearly clay there, a clay layer above the sandstone. And it was the clay pits all through here, which provided the clay for the bricks for the spread of Sydney in large part. But clearly the stone provided the earlier building material, the sandstone blocks, which I'll talk more about in a while. Now, sandstone is very soft, and it explains this big flat area here why we have Sydney Harbour essentially, because Sydney Harbour was carved by a creek which begins at Parramatta, flows all the way down here, and over countless millions of years just carved a valley through the sandstone, very much flatter and shallower here where it's the Wienermatta clay and shale, but really very deep around Sydney proper and North Sydney there for our deep water harbour. And there are two other freshwater rivers running down and cutting these other, the Lane Cove River there and the unnamed river that forms Middle Cove up here. So it's really very flat land. And there's of course the harbour there. So we would have a vastly different city if, in fact, we probably wouldn't have a city at all where it is without sandstone, because the sandstone created the harbour, and it was the harbour that attracted, well, took Cook's notice, and Phillip followed on from there. So that's why the British came in 1788 and pitched their tents and built their city. So it really is fundamental to the story of Sydney. The sandstone on the north side is a bit more streaky than the sandstone on the south side. That which was quarried around Piermont and Ultimo and used for the government buildings, the Treasury building and the Colonial Secretary's building, is called yellow block, and it's a really beautiful golden type of sandstone that's very even. You don't see too many of these stratas in there. Sometimes the blocks will be different colors, which suggests that they've been cut from different stratas, but the stratas aren't quite as narrow as they are on the north side. And it's my observation that it gets streakier and streakier the further north you go. So the current active quarries up around Gosford, which are providing sandstone for veneers and garden fences and whatever, walls rather, it really is a very streaky sandstone, and it's still used in Sydney, but whenever I see it, I just think, oh, that's Gosford sandstone that's been brought down. It's not Sydney sandstone. And yet it is all called Hawkesbury sandstone. So a little bit streakier in North Sydney than it is on the south side. And the sandstone was formed, 180 to 230 million years ago, which in terms of geological periods is, let me get this right, Triassic to Permian. Triassic is 180 to 220 million years ago, and Permian is after that. In the middle of the Permian, the coal seams were formed. So these on this map here are the grayer splodges there, that's the coal fields, the coal seam. So I showed you that earlier cross section. You saw that the coal sat underneath the sandstone. The sandstone was formed from sand that was swept down in a huge river when Australia was part of Gondwana, which is this great big mass of, I'm not sure if these are called cratons actually, but what we understand as continents before they drifted off. There's Africa and there's South America, and there's Antarctica. There's a huge river flowing here, which moved the rock along and created the sand, great river flats, and that hardened and was compressed and became the sandstone, which is many meters deep, very deep in Sydney and less so up in the mountains. So that the stone that we see all around us is around 220 million years old. And I find that when I'm reading about geology, it's really unhelpful that the books often talk about rivers running over Australia and all this. Australia really wasn't Australia as we understand it back then. It was part of Gondwana. You know, it was one part of a larger whole, clearly somewhat separated because it broke off around 50 million years ago and drifted up to where we currently are. But it's a little misleading and hard to imagine Australia. It certainly wasn't in its current position when these great rivers and were sweeping over and creating the sandstone, or earlier when the flora was being compressed to form the coal seams there. This is right down beneath on the bottom of the globe, essentially. Sandstone, the Hawkesbury sandstone, gives rise to the distinctive flora of Sydney, particularly on the north side, up towards the central coast, and the Banksia serrata. Sorry, I've lost the A from my Banksia there. Flannel flower, Angophora costata. There are many other species that thrive in this really nutrient poor soil and quite shallow soil. I mean, Angophoras, these trees, and this is Ball's Head on the right, are just astonishing. They're pretty large trees, and their roots somehow manage to sustain them and create stability in really shallow soils, wrapping themselves around whatever rocks they can find, but sometimes not even doing that. So yeah, but it's next time you wander through Berry Island or Ball's Head, where the two best stands of Angophora can be found, just have a look at the roots and wonder at how the tree remains standing. Aboriginal people, you know, who were here before the harbour was created. The harbour is the result of the end of the last glaciation, say 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. The glaciers are melting and the sea level is rising, and that river valley that I spoke about earlier fills with seawater. And what was a freshwater river or creek running from Parramatta becomes essentially an estuary, part of the harbour extending all the way back to the west there. So there would have been people before that. We know they're as far south as Tasmania, so almost certainly they're in this part of the continent by 10,000 years ago. They're in Tasmania 20,000 years ago. And they use whatever's available to them. And sandstone, being such a soft rock, is shaped by wind and water, and therefore there are any number of outcrops, and Aboriginal people use those where they can, on facing the west in colder months and the east in warmer months. You know, they're very sensible. And Ball's Head still has quite a few of those outcrops, so almost certainly Ball's Head would have been a favourite camping spot there. Here's an engraving based on an artwork done during the Baudin expedition around 1800, 1801, arriving in Sydney Harbour, and the engraving a little later. That to me looks a lot like Ball's Head. It's certainly the north side of the harbour. To my knowledge, Aboriginal people didn't build from stone, at least around Sydney. There's evidence, in fact, there are examples of the structures that were built in other places in Australia from stone, sometimes conical dwellings, usually not permanently occupied. But around Sydney, despite what Ruiz Pascoe's got in his book, he's quoting a chap called Dennis Foley, and I don't think anyone has confirmed the use of stone by Aboriginal people. It's either outcrops like this and caves, for want of a better term, overhangs, or timber branches and things for making small temporary shelters. Being such a soft stone, it's ideal for inscribing, and Sydney is sometimes described as the largest art gallery in the world because of all the rock art, a lot of which survives, but a hell of a lot more has been destroyed because of development. Ruth Park lived for a while in around 1950 to 55 with Darcy Nyland in Ben Boyd Road. I think it's 93 Ben Boyd Road, and she wrote in her memoir of a rock carving on the stone platform there, which hopefully is still there. This is the one that most people would be familiar with. It's up near the current coal loader sustainability centre, and it's impossible to know how old it is, but it is interesting to note that it's far more distinct here, and this is only 100 and something years ago, which suggests maybe it wasn't that old when Europeans turned up in 1788, because it has weathered quite a lot, and it wouldn't have weathered any more necessarily in the last 120 years than the previous years. I can imagine. There's no reason to think that. So I wonder if it's a fairly recent engraving. There are more engravings at Berry Island as well, and they're all around the harbour, particularly on the north side. And they're examples of some at Middle Head. I think there are still some engravings to be seen at Middle Head if you're wandering around some of the public land there. Europeans had a very different attitude to the land, and they didn't hesitate to change it very dramatically, not least by cutting down trees, which Aboriginal people tended not to do, but also blasting rock where it was seen to be in the way. And there's an example of an artificially created escarpment at Milson's Point. All that rock has disappeared altogether by now. You may not be familiar with Milson's Point as being a sort of a rocky peninsula, but it certainly was in the day, and they cut most of it away to create access there. This is by the end of the century with the Steam Ferry Company wharf, and we're talking here about where the north pylon of the bridge is. That ferry arcade was demolished in 1926. So lots of stone. In fact, the whole of the peninsula completely reworked, half removed and then totally removed. And as you're walking around North Sydney, which I'd encourage you to do, and I'll talk more about it at the end of the hour, and you're walking near escarpments and tall pieces of rock, just look at it and wonder whether it's natural or whether that has been shaped by humans, and whether it's a result of engineering and cutting. And I'll show you some ways to do that later in the talk. Here is a map from the 1890s, which shows an early quarry. There's St. Peter's Church, just to orientate you. St. Peter's is still there. There's Miller Street, and this is just called Old Quarry already by then. I wonder whether the stone quarried here was used to build the sandstone church St. Peter's, which was dates to the 1860s. This is a series of maps in the collection, all from the early to mid 1890s, which we have scanned and keyword searchable. And I typed in quarry, and I only pulled up three maps with quarries on them, and one of those was up near the Oaks Hotel today on Military Road. Vast quarry site there, but I didn't include that in the talk because I was wondering whether that was in fact a quarry for the brickworks. So the clay was being dug there, which would again be evidence that there was clay above the sandstone there. It was a really significant site just to the west of the Oaks Hotel today, west of Ben Boyd Road, and in between Ben Boyd Road and Merlin Street, and north of Military Road. So that may have been a rock quarry. It was called a quarry on the map, but I wonder, in fact, whether it was a brick pit as much as anything else. A really big site. But anyway, this is definitely a rock quarry here. I imagine there were quite a few around North Sydney because just practically speaking, rock is terribly heavy. There would have been many quarries on the south side, but if you're building with stone on the north side, you wouldn't want to have been shipping it across the harbour if you could use local stone. So I suspect, as much as possible, when you had a site near a rock outcrop, you would break that rock outcrop down as best you could, hoping the stone was good quality, and then use that. Here is Upton Grange, which is still there in Edward Street. It's now owned by Shaw School, and kind of unfortunately, this side of the building has been joined to another building, so you need to look twice to recognise it, but all this is still there, extant. And you can see here stone blocks that are being shaped. Either that is a stonemason's yard or it's a temporary storage yard for stone. I have found the occasional photograph of these piles of stone clearly either having just been used to build Upton Grange, which is brand spanking new in 1875, made from what I'm taking to be local sandstone, or there is another use in mind for these blocks. They're all over here as well. That looks like a stone workshed there. Stone clearly is a much more durable, permanent, and also more expensive building material. So St Leonard's, which is gazetted in 1838, North Sydney is not an entity until 1890, but through the 1840s and 50s, there's no brick buildings to speak of. The more permanent structures are stone, and most of them, however, are made of timber, either paling or weatherboard, in other words, or simply bark or something like that. This is the oldest house that I know of in North Sydney, dating to 1838, and that's still there, which is in Nook Avenue, just across in Neutral Bay. I suspect this is local stone too. This is a front view of it, and there's a view of the wall, which you can get very close up to in Nook Lane, just beside there. So all those pick marks were created in 1838 when the place was built. It's really extraordinary. It's been really well looked after. An addition at the back, but a sympathetic one. And you can see the sill. Yeah, really beautiful stone, looking a lot like the stone you'd see on the south side, in fact, but there's a bit of different colouring up here. But look at all those pick marks. Fairly irregular. I suspect that wasn't intentional. It's just practically speaking, but stone can be just dressed in the most perfect way, quite extraordinary, smoothly, or you may see a very even picking across it, which is an intentional decoration on the part of the stonemason. But this is all a bit haphazard, and I suspect is just used to flatten the stone so it can be used. Here is Camden Villa, dating to about 1865. That's still there, surrounded by tower blocks in Alfred Street. If you can find it, go into Milson Village, I think it's called, a little shopping area there, and you'll see this somewhat sad, beautifully restored but sad Victorian Georgian villa, which once had harbour views up and down the harbour. But this is an example of very smoothly and beautifully dressed sandstone here. It's really, really top quality stone dressing. Now, you've got fine ashlar blocks. The term for a big block of stone is ashlar, when it's clearly been cut and shaped by someone. And this is sort of a fine dressing here, and this is an intentional rough dressing to distinguish it, the base from the walls. And the line of a stone is called a coursing, and this is an even coursing. You do have random course as well, and I'll show you some examples of that later. This is even more finely dressed stone. This is Woodstock on the Pacific Highway, still there, 1870s, a bit later. You can see the slightly different coloured stone there, but really, really marvellous sandstone. You can go right up to that. There's no fence around it, and look at the peak marks. I suspect if you looked at the mortar between the two, but both in, sorry, Camden-Diller and Woodstock, if you looked at the mortar between the blocks, you may see little bits of shell. So it would be lime mortar, which is used by burning shell. Okay, the main style of building through the turn of the 19th century, or the late 18th through the turn of the 19th century, right up to the mid 19th century, is Georgian, whether we're in the Victorian period or not, which is very symmetrical, a sort of a classically derived architectural style, very refined. So even if it's not a heavily decorated or detailed type of building, still the stone tends to be very finely dressed. And the two examples I've just shown you are good examples of that. And by the end of the 19th century, we're moving into a period where English revival architecture is more the fashion in Australia, and it's because a lot of English architects came out and seeded the fashion here. And arts and crafts is one subset of that, and there was a love of more natural forms, lots of curves, many different types of shapes in a building, and therefore also a love of this sort of roughly cut stone intentionally. It's not that the stonemason was lazy or anything or trying to save time. This is all intentional. And this is an example of a random course wall. So you can see there's no particular line of stone there. You've got one and two there and another there and whatever fits together. So it creates a beautiful wall, but you can see the finish at the top here is very finely dressed there. So that's perfectly smooth. So it's not like the stonemason didn't know how to dress stone. It was what was demanded of the architect, who in this case was Edward Jefferson Jackson, who was one of the pioneers of that English revival style. That style of architecture and the influence of arts and crafts and natural forms and natural materials kicks on until the 1930s. And so therefore, with a lot of the large and small dwellings through North Sydney and elsewhere, but a lot of them in North Sydney, you will see a mix of stone, and particularly stone foundations, brick here, and sort of rough cast pebbly type render on sometimes on gables, but certainly on chimneys there. So that helps you date buildings as well when you see these type of foundations. So there's John Bertram Clamp was a very prominent architect, and you can see the stone base there. So it's very easy as you're wandering around Cremorne, particularly Cremorne Point, to find buildings with this type of stone base. This is BJ Waterhouse house. This is in fact his own house, the house he built for himself, the gables. And you can see he was a particularly prominent local exponent of that arts and crafts style. This huge roof planes come straight from CFA Boise, who was one of the prominent English exponents of the style. Good for dispersing snow, which you don't really need to do in Neutral Bay, but looks good anyway. You can see the timber shingles here, but he hasn't used, while he hasn't used stone foundations, he's certainly used it for his front fence. So he would have chosen that front fence almost certainly. And here's the little gatehouse he built for himself too. And the date of both the gables and this gatehouse made from sandstone is 1920. You can see that. This is another BJ Waterhouse house in Shell Cove Road, and yeah, the sandstone there is obvious. This is random course, so higgledy-piggledy. These little windows cut in there, it's English revival. That references the arrow loop, or a window for shooting arrows out of in a castle, believe it or not. But that's the extent to which little motifs from English architecture are used in this period. That's a chimney with a dovecote at the top. How about that? So it looks like a little dove house. That's how he's created his chimney. But even without architect designed houses, and this is a beautiful but fairly standard builder designed Federation bungalow in Neutral Bay, Spruson Street. You can see a retaining wall in the garden, and that would be contemporary with the house. And you can see sandstone on the base of the house there. Again, this is a random coarse wall, but all cut stone, not just lumps of stone found around the place. It's all been shaped. And that's the same house there. So sandstone really does express an identity in North Sydney. When you're looking at the buildings that were built, really from the 1830s, which is the oldest ones we have, and I've shown you Henbury Villa, right through to the 1930s. And these are some of the latest examples of the use of stone in a basement. And these are 1940s blocks of flats in Bent Street. This is really unusual because by this stage, architects are doing away with evidently natural material. Brick is made from clay, I realise, but generally blocks of flats are made from brick and trying to look as modern as possible. It's a modern way of living. But this architect, whoever it was, has chosen to make this block of flats quite distinguished with a very tall foundation of evenly coursed but rough ashlar blocks. And you will see today still people using garden stone walls. This one went up in a turn of the century pair of villas in Ridge Street in North Sydney, which I imagine built around 1900. But this wall went up in the last, I'm suggesting 1990 to 2000. Probably the stone came from Gosford, even though it's not too streaky. It's still multicolored there, which is fine. And there's an example of a modern random coarse brick wall. That'll age and weather and even out over time. Stone was the preferred building material for churches, without a doubt. And here are three of the earliest churches. 1860s for the Methodist Church, which was, if you can imagine the Pacific Highway running along here, that was demolished to widen the approach to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, unfortunately in around 1930. This is St. Peter's, and here is that quarry that I showed you on that map earlier on. So there is the stone being cut from a natural outcrop of stone, and possibly again used for that. But you can see any number of stone buildings there. That was bought, I think that's called Mercedes, and it's bought by the Catholic Church. St. Francis Xavier pops up there in the next few years, but this is Christchurch, the Anglican church above Lavender Bay. So almost certainly all that stone was derived locally. It's a lot of work for stonemasons. It's really heavy, so you don't want to be carting it around. And this time clearly is pre-motor transport. So think and feel for the poor horses that are dragging this stuff up and down the hills of North Sydney. North Sydney is much steeper than the south side. So the amount of labour that was used to build these buildings, goodness me. It really beggars the imagination sometimes. I put this photograph in because it clearly shows a church made from both brick and stone. It's one of my favourite churches in North Sydney. I used this picture in the talk on churches I did last month, I think. 1885, I have no idea where this clay comes from. I assume it's Sydney clay, but it's very red and very different to a lot of the other clay you see. Anyway, this is clearly sandstone. What happens around the turn of the century is either sandstone becomes so expensive that it's no longer used in churches, so you only see it for the detailing around windows and some of the coursing along here, and brick takes over as the main building material for churches through that, while they're still Gothic churches, from around 1900 through the 1940s, and stone pretty well disappears altogether. One prominent exception to that is St Mary's in Miller Street, which was rebuilt in 1938, and that is all stone with a brick interior. Having said that, but the exterior is all stone, so that's quite exceptional. But the architect here, whose name's just escaped me at the moment, he's a really clever use of brick and stone there. It's a really beautiful exterior. Now, the term is plastic, believe it or not. Plastic, before it meant plastic, that stuff we make toothbrushes and other things from, means something that's easily shaped, and sandstone is a plastic stone, and it lends itself to carving, which means it lends itself particularly to headstones, where you need to be able to carve. You need to be able to carve letters and inscriptions and bits of poetry and indicate who's buried there, but also all sorts of symbolic meanings. And there's a headstone which is no longer, unfortunately. Most of the headstones up at St Thomas's have gone, but we have a great photographic record of them, and they're lilies for meaning purity. Clara Smeal's headstone, 1903, quite late. Alec, the beautiful inscription on the very monument, which was the first monument of all to go in at St Thomas's. The pyramid was built of sandstone, beautifully dressed sandstone, beautifully put together. I mean, just immaculate building work in 1845. This inscription must date to 1873, because when Berry died and was placed in there. This is quite old. This mix of serifed lowercase font and the capitals there is very early 19th century, 18th century, but there it is being used in the late 19th century. But you can, yeah, it's much easier to carve into sandstone than any other type of stone, which explains why on marble monuments you tend to see lead lettering, because it's so much harder to create an even inscribed number or letter. There's beautiful ivy leaves on the Higley family. A lot of that has since either been vandalized or has crumbled off because of the weather. So the paradox of sandstone is that it's easily worked, and worked with such beautiful detail that you can see here with the berries and the leaves of the ivy, but it's also very fragile. So these headstones are deteriorating, some more than others, more rapidly than others, but they've been there, you know, for 120, 150 years or whatever, and they're starting to fall to bits, and they're almost impossible. Well, you can't restore them very easy. You can only try and keep them together, and then they just disappear altogether. One of the most interesting structures made from sandstone in North Sydney is the platform and the tunnels at the coal loader at Waverton there at Ball's Head. It's a very, very late use of sandstone for industrial purposes. And I suspect they used sandstone because there was so much sandstone there. I really encourage you to walk through the tunnels, because you will see that they've used natural outcrop of stone. They've used cut stone, particularly for the facing, but even in the tunnels. But they've also had to reinforce some of the tunnels with formworked cement. So either the stone wasn't as thick as they thought, or they had to reinforce and supplement it with concrete. You can see the formworked concrete here. That would have been created by great planks of timber there. How wide they are suggests that they're sort of hardwood from a North Coast forest somewhere. So that's all the cement formwork that you'll see inside the tunnels. And here's the facing stone. It's a really beautiful structure, and yet it's so utilitarian as well. So it's one of the last examples of just an example of the pride taken in creating a facility for moving coal, of all things, filthy coal, yet all this work has been, all this effort has been made to make it beautiful with facing ashlar blocks of stone. If I can show you here, these really finely worked keystones there, those keystones are still there and they're really beautiful. They are finely dressed. And that archway there, yeah, really worth going to see. And here you've got another looking west, I think, northwest perhaps, the other end of the tunnel. So this is formwork concrete there. There's rubble fill, and there's the facing stone. And this is what the workers would have seen on the outside. I mean, it's just beauty for beauty's sake, in a sense, or artisanal work for its own sake. Really amazing. So how are we going for time? Getting towards the end. I'd encourage you, particularly if you live in North Sydney, but if you don't come to North Sydney, and just walk around the bush areas and some of the streets, particularly around Neutral Bay. A lot of my photographs are from Bent Street and Winter Avenue, and this is not far from there, Forsyth Park, because you'll see sandstone everywhere. You know, that's how endemic it is. This is a place built on and of sandstone, and it's really nice once you realize that, if you haven't already, you start seeing it everywhere and appreciating and wondering about the different periods in which the stone has been used. So Forsyth Park, I know, wasn't really created as a public reserve until the 1930s or something. So that's when this stone was probably cut in this set of stone steps, and they've just aged beautifully. WHS people might have something to say, but we don't need railings and things on everything, perhaps. And there's an Angophorus, you know, sitting near the sandstone, and somehow the steps on a sandstone base and somehow staying up. There's that photograph I showed you earlier, not far from there. I mean, that's just the natural stone outcrop. That's amazing. Winter Avenue is a mystery to me. When you walk alongside the escarpment, you realize what a major engineering work it was to cut through a vast outcrop of rock to create this avenue around in the early years of the 20th century. That's as good as I can do at the moment in dating it, to provide access between Bent Street and Alfred Street. And yet I have no records of that work. I've not been able to find any minutes or reports or anything. So it must have taken so long. You can see here a trace of a drill bit has been forced down there and split the stone off, and some of it has been picked away here. So these are all the bits of evidence you can see on a wall as you walk past. You might have thought that was a natural escarpment. Well, it's not. What is natural is the water running down there, and there was a water course running from Alfred Street down to, what would it be, Careening Cove, which means there may have been natural waterfalls. I've got no photographs and good maps to show me exactly what that rock outcrop looked like before it was so dramatically altered by humans, by all this engineering. So whether it was a great sort of bulbous outcrop and there was literally a waterfall there or not, I really don't know. It's hard to tell from the rocks, but there's always water dribbling down the escarpment. And what has happened as a result of this modified landscape is you've got a microsystem, and ivy grows all the way down there, some of them in these long ropes of ivy, and you've also got self-seeded tree ferns popping up there. And if I've got photographs here, this is the same escarpment. This looks like stone that has been naturally weathered. In fact, it looks like the stone you'd see at Bondi or somewhere like that. Yet I'm pretty sure it's the weathering of rock that has been removed by humans. So this has happened in the last 100 years, natural weathering. Whenever you see these devices, they're called rock bolts. And that was a mechanism trialed in Australia for the first time in the Snowy Mountains scheme in the 1950s. So you can pretty well date it there to reinforce otherwise unstable rock faces. So possibly an engineer decided that there was a fissure happening here and they needed to stabilize it. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a rockfall or anything like that at all, but it's stabilizing it. But that gives you a clue that this escarpment has been artificially created. what's particularly nice in this area here is all under here, not so obvious in this photograph, are little cobwebs, thousands and thousands and thousands of spiders, and I don't know what species they are, have found a home in these rock overhangs that are possibly artificially created. There's also graffiti. I'm not a fan of graffiti, particularly painted graffiti, but anyway, it's sometimes interesting seeing historic graffiti, and this is L. Davis from 1940 something. I'm not sure what the next number is, but again in the same escarpment. And as you're walking around, have a look at the stone walls. Some of them retaining walls in North Sydney, particularly because it's such a steep, uneven municipality. There are sometimes roads where half the road will be a great deal lower than the other half of the road. This again is Bent Street, which has one of those double level areas in it. And you can see this part of the natural stone has been cut away with drills, and then they've used probably what was the local stone with this rough cut, evenly coursed stone wall here to just make a really pleasant streetscape. And they're all over North Sydney, these type of walls. There's another one way up in North Cremorne. And you've got here really just a random rubble wall. I don't know, I'm assuming that that is sandstone blocks there, but it may be a different type of stone, a type of pebble or river stone that's been sourced from somewhere else, or is evidence of some older geology. I'm really not sure, but this is all typical retaining wall used from the turn of the century through to the 1940s to create pathways and steps and parks and garden beds in parks all over North Sydney. This might just look like, if you're walking past it, just stone blocks one on top of each other, but when you look a bit more closely, you realize that someone has actually shaped these, not shaped them very much, but along there is the evidence that someone has put edges on all of these. Someone has taken the trouble to do that. So a stonemason has been at work, whether it's obvious or not. Ball's Head, here are the natural overhangs that almost certainly Aboriginal people would have used back in the day. When you look under these, you'll often see lots of soot, whether that's the soot of fires from Aboriginal people or people who've lived in these overhangs subsequently, possibly in the depression of the 1890s or in the 1930s. But anyway, this overhang here has been turned into a natural shelter when Ball's Head was turned into reserve from 1926, and then a lot of building or a lot of beautification happened in the 1930s. So there is a natural stone platform which is used as seating, and they've made this tapering, two tapering pillars there to shore up the overhang, and filled in the back there as well. That's also at Ball's Head. It's a random coarse wall there with a different type of stone here, and I'm not quite sure what this stone is, but they've filled that in with cement. Again, this was done in the 1930s. A lot of this type of stone work, particularly when it features cement like this, it dates from the 1930s. Reason for that being, there was relief work in the 1930s, so many people unemployed, and one of the ways to give them useful work was to create all these walls, safety walls and walkways through the parks, and you didn't need to be terribly skilled to find pieces of stone and just cement them in, and the fashion still was for the natural look, that arts and crafts natural look, and so they cast the concrete very roughly so it looked like stone, and they put chunks of stone in cement to make these barriers. You'll see that all over North Sydney. You'll see it up in the Blue Mountains too. This is a good example at Stanton Lookout. There's concrete there. This is cut stone, and you can see the drill marks there. That clearly was a huge piece of natural outcrop which was just cut away to create Jeffrey Street, possibly and probably during the building of the bridge. And there's an example at Carrabba Point. Stone, not as finely dressed, concrete with big chunks of stone on a natural outcrop there. So all of that I mean, that, to me, that looks pretty cool. It's a heritage headache. You can see the Rio there, the steel Rio is rusting away and the concrete's falling away. That's a headache for someone else. Now, I'll just finish up now. So, and just emphasise that stone is an integral part of the local character of North Sydney. And here's a good example of that in Bennett Street up in Cremorne. This is all natural stone, and there is the retaining wall. This is in the public domain, so council is aware of this and is aware that sandstone is so important for defining North Sydney. But if you're aware of stone outcrops or stone walls, and particularly if they're on private property and you think they should be protected in some way, heritage listed, you can also always contact council and let them know that there are unfortunately examples of natural stone outcrops on private land that have been completely excavated and tunneled through to create new garages or whatever. So the more I mean, it's destruction by 1,000 cuts. You know, the more you chip away, the more you lose, but you don't necessarily notice as it's happening. So it really is worth wandering around and noticing the particularly special bits of stone and letting council know. The best way to defend heritage is by residents contacting council and particularly your local councillors, your elected representatives, because you're the residents, you're the ratepayers, and you're the people that matter, and opinions coming from you mean more, I suspect, than those coming from experts. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, and thanks for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them.